From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all for what promises to be a fascinating program on an award-winning book entitled Street Level: Drawings and Creative Writings Inspired by the Cultural and Architectural Heritage of Dar es Salaam. And we will have not one, but 4 speakers to discuss this presentation, so that should be really exciting. As most of you already know, our division is made up of 3 sections: the African, the Near Eastern, and the Hebraic sections. We are responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Saharan. Our Hebraica and Judaica collections come from all over the world. We also serve these materials to patrons here in our reading room and organize programs, exhibits, conferences, and other activities that highlight these collections and that inform our patrons about the countries and the cultures these publications come from. Our presentation today is a case in point. The speakers today will focus on the architecture of the city of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. In addition to Sarah Marks, the illustrator and compiler of the book, we also have Karen Moon, who is the cultural heritage specialist and focuses on built environment, and Hafiz Juma, one of the contributor writers of the book and its co-publisher. Now, Brenda Randolph, Director of Africa Access and Chair of the Children's Africana Book Award Committee, will say a few words about this award of the award-winning book. Okay, Brenda.
My organization, one of them, of course, is Africa Access, and we are happy to co-sponsor today's program. Africa Access is a bibliographic and review service. We provide information about and reviews of K-12 books on Africa. Now, our reviews differ from those in School Library Journal, Horn Book, Book List, and other library journals in one important way. They are written by African Studies scholars. Africa Access is a member of the Outreach Council of the African Studies Association. The council sponsors the Children's Africana Book Awards, which we call CABA for short. We are really happy because this is CABA's 20th year. We gave our first award in 1992, and now we have over 60 winners. And you can see a list of the winners on the Africa Access website, which is, it's that long thing. So Google Africa Access Review, and it should pop up. And then you will go to the awards page, the Africana Awards page, to see the winners. This year's winners for 2012 are Stones for My Father by Trilby Kent, which is a historical novel set in South Africa during the Boer War, and Street Level, a collection of drawings and creative writing inspired by Dar es Salaam, compiled and illustrated by Sarah Marks, who is here with us today all the way from Dar. Also with us is Karen Moon, who wrote the historical introduction to Street Level and the captions for the illustrations. And after a dance with a wild woman named Sandy, Sandy, not Sarah, that hurricane in New York, is Hafiz Juma, who also lives in Dar and is with us. He is a contributor to Street Level and publisher of the 2nd edition. Isn't it great? We have 2 editions of this book. I'm going to hold up the first one by Mechina, which was published. And we have a second one. Is it We Don't Read? We Don't Read. So we have 2. You can get information about how to order these wonderful books on the Africa Access website, on the Africana Awards page. You just click in and you can go to the publishers to order the books. You know, rarely do we have a book that can span ages young to older. Street Level is that wonderful book because of the illustrations, because of the little short captions. Right after this program, we're going downstairs to the Young Readers Center here at the Library of Congress to do a program with middle school students. So it's a wonderful book. We are so happy to have the author, contributors to this book, and we're just so grateful that we could, in the African Studies Association, give this book an honor award. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to our program on Street Level. I feel like maybe I don't have to say anything because I think everybody else has something more to say. But I do want to make everybody aware that this program is being webcast. So by asking questions, you're agreeing to be a part of that webcast. And if the questions are not clearly heard, we'll ask the speakers to repeat the question so that we can have it on the webcast. This webcast goes on the Library of Congress website as well as our division webpage and can be seen by anybody all over the world at any given time. So it goes down into the annals of history. My name is Eve Ferguson. I'm reference librarian for East Africa, and I'm really pleased to have this program. When I saw this book, I was just absolutely stunned by the beauty of it, and we'll hear more about how this book came together. I am going to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Marks, and fortunately I'll be able to get out of here very quickly and make room for all of the other speakers who have a lot more to say than I do. Sarah Marks studied graphic design and illustration at Central St. Martin's College of Art in London before starting to work and travel as an illustrator. She moved to Malawi in 1998, where she explored her creative skills in a variety of educational media, from comic books to training manuals and radio shows. She's lived in Dar es Salaam since 2002, juggling graphic design, illustration, painting, and exploring beautiful places. So we want to welcome to the podium now Sarah Marks, the author of Street Level. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for all the lovely kind words and great introductions. So I'll skip to basic arriving in Dar es Salaam. So when I arrived in Dar, I was working for a publisher and my office was located in the centre of town. So from my very first few days in the city, I started exploring the hot, bustling streets of the town centre in my lunch hours and orientating myself with the minarets and the sun, and being completely entranced by the amazing mix of architecture and people that is Dar es Salaam. And on these walks, I quite quickly realized that a lot of the old buildings I admired were being knocked down and replaced with high-rise. I could see the character of the city changing month by month, as not only the buildings were being lost, but the environment around them was changing. Public space was decreasing, and the whole ecosystem of people and nature around each building was being transformed. So sadly, I didn't have time to engage in the issue until 2009 when I went freelance. And I started quite randomly walking around with my sketchbook and trying to find shady spots to draw. But this often confused people in Dar es Salaam. I got accosted many times and asked what on earth I was doing and could I not afford a camera which would make my life easier. So these people did have a good point. Dar is not an easy place to draw. The streets are hot and narrow and thick with pedestrians, street vendors, cars, buses, bajajis, bicycles. So even if I did find a good spot to draw, several times people would come and park a lorry in front of me, or I'd be too slow and then I'd be sitting in the sunshine and my sketchbook and me would kind of just become a very sweaty mess. But as time went on, I became slightly more organized and started researching the history of the city and its architecture, its planning, and also planning what I wanted to draw and taking photos of the buildings to base the drawings on. So I started building up a body of work and realized that there were many other people that were also passionate about the urban environment and heritage of Dar, which further inspired me. I also realized how little material there was about Dar es Salaam and felt it was high time someone started singing the praises of such an underappreciated but fabulous place. And so much of the history of Dar is unwritten. Almost every time I sat on a street drawing or walked around with a camera, I would end up chatting to someone who would share a little insight into their area, their building, their family, their life. So I wanted to create a forum and a storehouse for all these stories. So that was the birth of Street Level. And from the start, I wanted it to be a very creative and collaborative project, trying to portray the city in a contemporary and realistic way, rather than as a dry history or just a nostalgic kind of account by a Mzungu, which is a foreigner. And during my work with different NGOs in Dar, I'd had the great good fortune to meet some fabulous writers, young Tanzanians who were mainly working in journalism, education, but a lot of them aspiring to be creative writers, but without a forum. And Dar being quite a cosmopolitan city with a wide racial and economic disparities, as well as significant differences between different areas, I wanted to try and portray some of the different views of the city from different residents' perspectives. So I decided to invite all the writers I knew to submit pieces for the book. And as luck would have it, and the way Dar works, the word spread, and I ended up with 17 fabulous writers in the book. And by now I was actually beginning to believe this might happen, so I got a bit bolder and I approached Karen and some other historians to see if they would also contribute the academic and the factual backbone. So Karen very kindly agreed, and this is the first page of her introduction to the book, and she'll tell you a lot more. So although the book was primarily inspired by the demolition of the city centre's old buildings, and this is one of the fabulous buildings that's been demolished, I also wanted it to capture as much of the character and atmosphere of the city as possible. So frequently the new buildings would spread right to the edge of plots, old pavements disappeared, trees were cut down, so all the valuable kind of social space for sitting and chatting and trading was lost. A lot of these buildings are from the Asian part of the centre of town, which originally were family-run businesses with accommodation on the first floor, but all these were making way for offices, and the whole network of street vendors and businesses were being lost. And like most cities, Dar has some fabulous quirks and details, which I wanted to convey. Every morning in Dar es Salaam, there's this train of young men cycling into town bringing eggs on their bicycles. There's coffee traders that are walking around the streets, and there's also a fabulous array of hand-painted signs. So I'll just give you a very brief outline of the structure of the book. So I organised it into 8 sections. The first one is called Street Sense, which starts with a map just so people can orientate the buildings and the drawings. This is followed by Street Scene, introduced by Karen's overview, and then it's a series of drawings in as chronological order as possible. It's probably not 100% accurate, but we tried, of architectural drawings and street views. And within this selection, I tried to include some of the key buildings from different eras, with a focus on those that were most in danger of demolition. And much as I would have liked to have worked on the whole of Dar es Salaam, that was just impractical, so I had to constrain myself to the city centre, which is most in danger of being demolished. And then the next chapter is street life. So this is an introduction to the people of Dar. So here we have a street sweeper, a street vendor, a woman kind of sweating in the heat, and a policeman. So I tried to portray the diversity of ethnicity, religion, poverty, prosperity amongst the city's workers and pedestrians. The next chapter is street trade. So one of my first memories of Dar es Salaam was walking down the street from my office and being amazed by the amount of second-hand shoes for sale. And it's one of the things I love about the city, that on every street there'll be a little shop, a duka, a stall, a vendor selling the most random things, from water to hat stands, peanuts, Arsenal stickers. So the next chapter is called Street Move. So this is about the transport. And as with many less developed cities, especially those with rapidly developing traffic issues like Dar, Dar has an array of innovative, bold, and sometimes reckless forms of transport. The city has a bit of a love-hate relationship with dala-dalas. This is a dala-dala, which is a public bus. They often have great slogans on the back. They're crammed. They often drive like maniacs, but they're such an important part of the character of Dar es Salaam. And then there is street cuisine. Because of the diverse mix of people in Dar, there's quite an array of different foods. On the top right is a chipsi mai, which is a classic Dar es Salaam dish. It's basically a chips or a fries omelette. Maybe cuisine is a bit glamorous term for it, but it's a fabulous, healthy meal. And then there's often women walking around with snacks in buckets. There'll be guys roasting maize on the side of the road. And then the next chapter is called Street Green. And much as I would have liked this to be a bit more extensive, it's basically a very small kind of glimpse of the stunning natural environment of Dar on the Indian Ocean, lined with palm trees, white beaches. It's cliched, but it is gorgeous. Lots of sheltered harbours and coral reefs. And then the final chapter is called Street Style. So this sort of rounds off the book and the main point of the book. And it's an essay by two architectural historians, and they outline the extent of the demolitions and also the contributing factors, which are many and complex, but there's ineffective legislation, the complete confusion of multiple stakeholders with different agendas, rising land value and population density, and of course the desire for profit and modernisation. So when the first edition went to print, we stated that more than 30% of the commercial district had been demolished in the last 5 years. And now it's nearly 2 years later and the rate has not abated at all. But I do like happy endings, so part of the point of this chapter is to outline positive ideas to combine development with heritage conservation. And in the book there's a beautiful building that is actually owned by the tax authority, which has been renovated. So it's hard, but I think there's more of an energy now to start working on these issues. And then in addition to the book, I started a blog, which again is basically trying to create a forum for the writers, the art, and also try and encourage people to share their stories with me. And I also produced a series of postcards and prints, fully aware that many people maybe can't afford a book or that's not their thing, but just to spend a few shillings on a postcard, it gets the artwork out there and hopefully more people engaged in the project. And sadly, the book is already becoming a historical record. Several of the buildings that I drew have already been demolished. And while I really can't pretend it's a completely exhaustive or comprehensive record of the city, I can say it does serve as an introductory awareness-raising tool. And I've had feedback from all over the world, which was fabulous. People that have grown up in Dar or built buildings or have relatives there. So at the end of the day, I'll just summarise to say that Street Level is basically, it's an arty book, but it's a celebration of Tanzanian creative writing, urban culture, history, and at least an introduction to the city that I and many others love so dearly. And if you want to find out more, you can check the blog or there's a website here. And thank you very much. Asante sana. Asanteni sana.
Hello, I'd just like to give you some background to the buildings in Sarah's book and the historical context. Though I never formally worked on Dar myself, I lived there for 5 years and I got to know it very well and became quite passionate about its interesting heritage and how that heritage reflects the whole history of how people lived together. Dar is a huge city. It's over 4 million people and one of the fastest growing in Africa, as I'm sure you're all aware. And in 1860, there was no Dar es Salaam at all. It was just a few settlements in the area. And its early history was dominated by a whole succession of colonial powers. The Omani Sultanate in Zanzibar was the principal power at the time. And in the 1860s, Sultan Majid decided to build a new town on the mainland and chose Dar as his site, primarily because of its good harbour. So this idyllic picture at the top shows Dar in 1873 with some of the Sultan's buildings there and portrayed as the haven of peace, which the name Dar es Salaam translates as haven of peace, or that's one of the translations. And below you can see the strip of buildings that were along the riverfront there. And this is a map from 1891. So after the Sultan died in 1870, nothing much happened until the Germans arrived, and Dar became the capital of German East Africa in 1891. And this map's important because it shows you how the city was laid out by the Germans. You've got, here was the Sultan's buildings along the riverfront, and behind the Asian traders gathered and started business. And over on the east side, the Germans took the land by the seafront, where the ocean breezes came and made it so much cooler. And this is all the German area here, where they had an agricultural station and so on. So also notice on this map the way these streets, the ring road streets, and then these radiating lines from the riverfront form the whole character of Dar's streets, and you get these crossroads and multiple junctions and roundabouts, and at these junctions you get these interesting corner plots with angles where people built, and you'll see as I move on. That's in 1945 when the British took over after the First World War, and you can see how much this centre developed, and over here is Carriacou. The whole planning idea was to separate the races, so that you've got the Germans here, the Asians here, and the Africans cut off here by the cordon sanitaire, which was cleared by the British, so that the African settlement was separate.
Take a moment for adjustment.
Sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the type of buildings by these different cultural groups. This is one of the few remaining Omani buildings in Dar, taken in an old picture from the 1950s. And it still survives today. A very austere architecture with a flat roof, and there you can see it on the front is this building, with some German buildings over here, and more Omani buildings along there, which have all gone except for this one. Here are some more German buildings. The Germans used modern building methods and imported some prefabricated parts and steel joists from Germany, but they also used stone, the traditional coral stone building method for some of their buildings. And then they combined a style of Oriental sort of style with these windows and the dome. And that's very typical of their colonial architecture in Africa. Here's some more German buildings, and they still survive in the streets today, precariously. And this is the British period, where you can see how orderly and laid out it was, with formal gardens along the riverfront. And on the right is Mosque Street, with two of the mosques in the Asian area. This is a picture also from 1940s, which shows how well it was built up in the British period. The British encouraged the Asians to develop, and they upgraded the building regulations, and Asian businesses did it very well under the British, so you get a whole development in the Asian area of these lovely buildings. And this is the one on the front of Sarah's book, and this one over here I'll show you next. They had a lot of Gujarati Indians who came to Dar and brought over the styles with the fretwork and the overhanging balconies. And here are some of the details of some of the religious buildings. This is the Hindu Om sign, and this was also a Hindu community religious building. And here is the Ismaili Jamat Khana, where the Ismailis met, and the Bora Mosque. And this is the view of Dar in 1950, I think. And you can see how the regularity of the heights of the buildings, which has changed so much today, and the sort of conformity of the historic district at that time, which is being destroyed now. These are some of the corner buildings on the plots that I mentioned. And some more here, which you'll see illustrated in the book. And these are the names, some of the names and dates on the buildings, which became a very popular feature of the buildings. The businesses that were doing well wanted to display their family name, and the dates are between 1930s and 1950s, when more modern architecture came in. You get these Art Deco details and names and dates. I just want to give you a quick look at Carriacou, although it's not covered in the book, because it's the African area that was over to the west side, and it developed very slowly compared to the other parts of town. So these are the thatched huts. This picture was taken in the 1950s, but nothing much had changed really since it started. And here on the right, you can see the laid out grid of Carriacou, and then the cleared area cleared by the British here, which separated the African settlement from the Asian business district. And then over here, you've got some of the German buildings on the riverfront. This was an African, this was the market that was built in the African area in Carriacou in 1974 by Jacob Amuli, and it's supposed to represent trees and an open-air African market. And this is one of the factors that's changed Carriacou. It's become more central and more built up. On the left is this from 1970, from just before 1970. You can see how little Carriacou had changed all those years when the Asian area was building up, and on the right, how it is today. So very quickly it's transformed, and all that, the cultural heritage of the buildings has been lost. There's not been any sort of review of what's there to see what could be saved and what could, help people to understand their history and where they've come from. And this today shows you how the building heights have changed so much. There's been so many demolitions and there's no planning for the conservation area. That's just a comparison of Samora Avenue in the 1950s and last week, and it looks like nothing much has changed, although you can see some tall buildings at the back. But this is really what's happening in Dar, and this is what a lot of the streets look like. That building on the left there, this was taken just before they demolished it. That was the building on the left, and you can see what a fine building it was, and built in 1930s. This was a survey that was done by a group of concerned people in between 2004 and 2007 to try to identify what the heritage buildings were and where they were, because there was nothing being formally done. The red buildings are, well, they look orange here, are the buildings protected by law, which are mostly mosques and some of the churches and public buildings. The yellow buildings were identified as of special interest in this survey, and the grey buildings are the ones that give context, also historical buildings of lesser value, but giving context to a historic neighbourhood. And these are the demolitions that happened between 2007 and 2009. In that very short time, it lost a lot of buildings in the centre here of India Street and in the central business district area where the Asians lived. And the demolitions continue. This building, which is on the front of Sarah's book, is a very fine building that you saw in that view of the 1940s. Now, it's there in the middle again. You can see it's surrounded by tower blocks. And this building on the top left, that's a view of it in the past, and then one more recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, which is vibrantly painted and does frequently use colours. That's the site today. It's gone, and that was on one of these corners that were so so dramatic because of their angled plots and the way they represented a whole architectural outlook of the place. So you might wonder why nothing's been done about preserving these buildings, and it's very complex, the set of reasons that are why nothing is being done. You'd think that they could make a historic district with for cultural and leisure pursuits for the residents, but there are a lot of problems, and I'm going to just mention a few of them. The buildings have been poorly maintained over a long period, and this is general for lots of older buildings in Tanzania. So they're commonly associated with poor conditions and lack of services. Then there's a lack of familiarity with the whole idea of historic preservation, with no good rehabilitations there for people to see in Tanzania. And there are negative associations with the colonial past, which is understandable. So there's often a lack of sense of ownership of the non-African heritage. And then there's the more political interest in being a modern economic centre and attracting investment. And in the drive for modernisation, the value of older buildings is often lost. And the central business district just isn't suitable for this type of development. As Sarah has said, there are problems with infrastructure and transport and parking. So really, Dar's losing its heritage and its character, and this is an area which it could still be saved. There are still areas where there are groups of buildings together, and there are lots of very beautiful buildings there. Tanzanians really need to find a way to connect their heritage, even if it's ambiguous, with the colonial past. So a few things are changing, as Sarah said, and also there's a master plan being developed which is taking conservation into account. But the question is, will it move fast enough? I hope there'll be a happy ending, but I'm not so sure. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm one of the contributing writers to the Street Level, and when Sarah first told me about this book and gave me the opportunity to write for it, I wanted to give a little glimpse of what I thought of Tanzania and what Tanzania meant to me. At the same time knowing that I see it from a certain place of privilege. So I focused in on the street traders and what are called the Machinga in Tanzania collectively as an umbrella term. And the Machinga are street traders, like Sarah alluded to earlier, who you can find anything from shoes to socks to hats and umbrellas to peanuts and cigarettes and water. And I kind of created a metaphor from them, about them, and called them almost commercial poets, because they kind of knew what you wanted before you even knew yourself. You'd be on the road driving and just think about, I need a glass of water, I need something to refresh my thirst. And before you can even think about getting it, someone's at your window offering you that bottle of water. And slowly, these traders are disappearing. And I blame this a little bit on this kind of, again, another umbrella word of Tanzania becoming an emerging economy. And I won't get into the politics of what I think that means. But I think a lot of Tanzania's slowly of Dar and these street traders slowly disappearing. What you see is because of cheap influx of Chinese goods, these street traders are being pushed out of the corners and being replaced by Chinese traders who don't have to get work permits to work in Tanzania and can bring in goods for very cheap. And then there's also a kind of systematic repopulation policy in Tanzania, in Dar, where to clean up the city, we're getting rid of these street vendors and from all the corners of the city and moving them into isolated buildings. There's actually a new building that has just come up called the Mechina Complex, which is kind of ironic. It's taking the Machinga, who are known as the street traders, into a centralized location in the outskirts of town where no one goes. So there's a curse and a blessing in this whole idea of emerging economy and the middle class. And as Karen also alluded to, I think there's this idea that it's for the good. It's in the name of development, and these things have to happen. And I'm not so sure, and I'm not entirely convinced. And I think what's starting to happen is there's this idea kind of percolating in through to Tanzania from popular culture. And a lot of that is because there's a vacuum in our educational system being filled by popular culture. And we're being told this is who we should be, this is who we should aspire to be. And so through those kind of false perceptions of what a developed country should be, we're trying to embody that. So what's quickly happening is Old Dar is being confined to nostalgia, to the realm of nostalgia, and books like Street Level are, like Sarah mentioned, are becoming historical artifacts where a lot of this stuff no longer exists. And I know Sarah left off with a kind of positive, optimistic note, and so did Karen, but I think I'm a bit more pessimistic. I feel that as long as these arms and branches of geopolitics come into Tanzania, and people see these as a good thing, we're going to see more and more of this old Dar being confined to the realm of nostalgia as we navigate to find our footing of who and how we want to be perceived in this new world. And that's my 2 cents.
Well, I really want to thank our speakers because they gave some insight into a place that many of us may not have been yet, but I think probably will want to go after this. I did want to open it up to questions, but also before I take some questions, I wanted to encourage people to please use our collections on Tanzania. They are very large. Kenya and Tanzania are the largest collections on East African countries that we have. A few years ago, we had a visit from the Honorable Samuel Sita, the Speaker of Parliament for Tanzania, who was pleasantly surprised and very overwhelmed by the amount of materials that we have here in Tanzania. Because the African section is non-custodial, you will find those collections distributed throughout the reading rooms in the library. But you can easily do a search of them, and we hope that you will further discover what the Library of Congress has on Tanzania, as well as make sure to get a copy of this lovely book. This one is mine, but I will pass it around for people to take a look at it. And Brenda, the Children's Africana Book Awards tomorrow are open to the public?
Exactly, yes.
Okay,
11 o'clock at the National Museum of African Art.
Okay, so 11 o'clock at the National Museum of African Art, you'll be able to go down and attend the Children's Africana Book Awards, a very worthy pursuit, which makes sure to keep Africa in the minds of young people. So I would like to thank all of our speakers for coming. Pardon me? And yes, if you would all like to come up here to answer any questions, as I said, when you ask questions, you're agreeing to be on that webcast, and I will leave it up to them to determine who wants to answer what question. So if you want to stand.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, and each one of you can answer. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this fabulous presentation. And I wanted to ask, in this new building phase that Dar es Salaam is seeing, is there a new style? You spoke of the German style, the British style, the Asian style. Now, is there a new Dar es Salaam style, which is coming through in the new architecture? Or is it coming, or are people discussing it?
Well, I think the architects are discussing it in the Architectural Association, and I left in 2007, so I'm not really up to date with what's happening now. But certainly there's, generally speaking, when you see the new architecture that's coming up, it's very mediocre, and a lot of it is not well planned. And the buildings are just unsuitable for the environment and rely on air conditioning when there's, lack of regular power supply sometimes, and they're not really very appropriate to the context at all. But I think there are people who are thinking about that question and working on it.
But I'll just add one thing, and I think also the financial constraints. So a lot of people are building very cheaply. I think in recent years, even a couple of buildings have fallen down because they're just put up so quickly. There's a lot of Chinese labour. So the aesthetics is sort of an added extra, which is not really considered, unfortunately, I think because of the budgets. There's a couple of architects that are combining some of the Art Deco, but again, I think they're very restricted to the clients that will pay that amount of money for an interesting building as opposed to a cheap glass high-rise.
And I'd just like to add, if you asked, is there a name to this style, I would call it cheap Chinese buildings. And the thing is, what's happening is if you go to Nairobi, for instance, Nairobi's urban landscape is transforming as well, and you're starting to see that there's no differentiation between the two cities. The buildings are exactly the same. They're mediocre, not ventilated, hard to keep cool, and yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, I would call it Chinese cheap.
My question is about Dar es Salaam and its multiculturalism. It's a very multicultural city, and as Karen pointed out, there were different quadrants. Are those individual communities making any attempt to preserve the heritage
Want to go? Answer.
Yeah, there is a group that's trying to get together to form a sort of heritage society, and they've been talking about it for a year or so, and there is an interest there, but don't think it's been very dynamic and done anything very much yet. What was your? Oh yes, and also the communities. I don't know that anybody is doing very much in the communities. I don't know about the Asian communities and whether either of you know whether there's anything happening there. But it's often been sort of like expatriates that have seen the value of some of these things, because it's sometimes difficult for the people to see that when they're living in rundown buildings. But you might have other...
Well, yeah, I think there's a diaspora community who is very interested in preserving these buildings. But locally, a lot of the groups are, as you said, full of are expat-led groups, or like you mentioned earlier, a bunch of Mzungus trying to protect these buildings. And it's really hard to save them when you don't have that local ownership. A good example is the Court of Appeals in Tanzania, in Dar. It's a beautiful building right on the waterfront, and there's a debate going on right now about it being torn down to become a parking lot for a Hyatt. And these are the kind of things that are happening. So the policies in place also don't allow for people to try and preserve these things.
I'll add just one other thing. I think part of the root of this problem is a lot of the buildings in the town centre were nationalised independent. So a lot of the Asian families that had built these buildings suddenly lost all their property, and now it's in the hands of the government. So it's already been removed one step down the chain. So some of the families managed to get their buildings back, or hang on to, very few hang on to them, but that's kind of added another level, which is hard to then, for those families to re-embrace their buildings if they're still there. Yeah, I think I'll just say one thing. You're absolutely right, and it's a very young population that's growing very quickly. The thing with Dar es Salaam, it's very geographically constrained in the town centre, so much as National Housing and Ministry of Lands they're giving permits for a minimum of 8 stories, 10 stories in the town centre, but there just isn't the infrastructure. We have chronic power rationing. The roads, they can't cope with the sewage and everything. So Dar is basically spreading outwards. So it's becoming a big sprawl in all the directions it can go. And then December last year, there were big floods. And it was heavy rain, but not completely outrageous. But because so many of the natural changes have been built over, that suddenly you've got all these problems that come from the urban development. So I think at the moment, Dar is just going to carry on spreading outwards and upwards a little bit, but it's just the infrastructure that constrains the efficient development.
Something about those Chinese cheaps as well is they're really expensive to live in. So although they're very poorly built buildings, they're cheaply done, the rent prices are very, very expensive. So the majority of Tanzanians can't even afford to live in these new buildings. So the old buildings are being torn down. We do have a housing crisis. There is a huge population of people in Dar who don't have appropriate housing, but they can't afford to live in these new buildings regardless. So. That's a question. I think a lot of these buildings do cater to an expat and Asian community. Additionally, and I don't want to kind of presume things, but I also think a lot of it is ways for wealthy people to make an investment and kind of, I guess, clean dirty money.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I think, again, a lot of people in Dar do appreciate it, but it's not, I mean, I find that when I've done pictures of Dala Dalas, a lot of the Tanzanians are sort of amazed to see it portrayed because it's such a sort of normal and not glamorous thing. They just think it's quite entertaining. And also I think there's a certain amount of pride in it, but the art scene also in Tanzania is quite small, and the contemporary art is also, there's not really a big space for it. So I think it's, in a very informal manner, it's appreciated, but unfortunately not in a more formal, organised way. And also one of the problems now, I think, is a lot of the art on the Dala Dalas, but also street signs, is becoming, again, Chinese, so it's cheap to get an Arsenal sticker, or, you know, you can get something kind of flashy and bright and stick it on rather than paint your own slogan. So it's also kind of transforming and being lost a little bit. But I think it's fabulous. So.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to get your opinion on if President Nyerere was alive this morning. Is President vision for his country, or how do
You answer that one.
Well, I'm a bit biased because Nyerere is one of my heroes. So I would say I would hope not. I don't think this would be part of his vision. And that's what I think one of the reasons why you can say that as well is there's a lot of this transformation happened after his death. I think his death gave an opportunity for a lot of these, I guess these politicians in waiting to kind of implement policies that they couldn't when Nyerere was alive. So I don't think he would approve, especially like question earlier alluded to, there's a housing crisis, and I don't think he would allow for these exorbitantly priced houses to be around when people can't afford them.
May I follow up on this? I mean, Ujama also went to the rural areas. Is something coming from the rural areas to the cities? In other words, again, I'm thinking of style, of construction, of way of living. Is there a feedback from the rural areas to the city? With after Nyerere moved outwards, is there a movement in that brings in not only people looking for jobs, but a style or something that could change the landscape?
I could say something about that. That I think that there's a problem for Tanzanians in that they have lost a continuity in their culture as far as architecture goes. And their architecture was rather disregarded by the colonial powers. So they don't have that continuity that the Asians had, or that the British had, or the Germans had in building in new materials in the new century. They're suddenly now, it's their country and they can build, but they've lost a sense of, I feel, of what their style was and where they should go from here. And I think that's now being discussed by Tanzanian architects. But what they've done is they've embraced modernism, and they've embraced, what the West has, because they want to be modern, which is also what Hafiz was saying. And I think there's a sort of disconnect in the style of Tanzanian architecture, which, I think that Tanzania should be looking back at their roots and thinking, what parts of their the way they design their spaces, the way they live, should be incorporated. What sort of styles are meaningful to them that they could incorporate. I think that's a very important thing that African architects generally should be thinking about, not just in Tanzania.
One thing I want to add to that as well, I think another good example of faulty policy is there's actually a museum in Dar called the Macumba Village Museum. And what's really interesting about it is it's a museum of rural ways of building, rural buildings, rural building styles, rural housing. And it was confined to this museum when people still lived like that and do live like that. But almost that kind of structure of the museum made it seem like this doesn't work or fit into the modern place we're going. So I think looking back is almost seen as going backwards.
I want to thank our speakers, first of all. Just another small footnote, and that is that speaking of Julius Nyerere, we have a significant number of writings by Julius Nyerere, both in English and in Swahili. So that's another plug for the collections. I want to thank our speakers who I think have to move on now and go downstairs to the children's literature, or is it young readers?
Young readers.
Young Readers Literature Center. Again, I want to thank you all for coming and to thank our speakers and welcome you back next week on Wednesday, November 7th at 3:30. We will have a program with Kenyan poet Anna Mwalago as a part of the African Poets and Writers series. So please watch out for our programs. They are posted on our website, and we'll be on a roll through the remainder of the year. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you. Have a good afternoon.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.